All right. Yes.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live with Prof Tim Noakes. We are so excited to have you all here with us today. Before we start, if this is your first time joining us, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to come and ask Prof all your health, performance, and nutrition related questions. And I quickly just want to share a few exciting things with you. So first up is that the Nutrition Network's Carnivore course is finally live. I feel like we've all been waiting for this for such a long time. So head over to their website and have a look. And then also, first of its kind, Whole Body Health will be launching in April. This is a 12-week program by the Nutrition Network, which is supported by dietitians, coaches, and doctors, and it is a live interactive training. You can have a look if it's something that's of interest to you or some of your friends or family. I highly recommend share this with them. This is our pilot, and we are so excited to see the results. So, Prof, before we dive in, I want to hand over to you. Is there anything you would like to share with our audience today?
Yeah, I'm just thinking probably we last spoke a month or two ago.
Yes.
So what have I been doing? Well, I'm working very hard on the 5th edition of Law of Running. And it's been 20 years since I last edited certain chapters. And I'm currently going through chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and adding a new chapter, chapter 6, on the central governor. So if you know those chapters, they've been completely, utterly, completely revised. And the revision focuses on brain controls of exercise rather than metabolic limitations. So we're getting rid of the whole story that you're limited when you exercise and your performance is limited. It's not regulated. And that's the key. And the brain is there to regulate it. And so there was a lovely paper yesterday, for example, which studied pacing strategies for people doing 40K time trial in the laboratory at varying levels of heat. And guess what? Within the first 5 minutes of starting, if they're in the hottest conditions, they're already slowing down. So you always slow down long before you get a problem, and that's how the brain works. And we've completely ignored that factor. And there are so many interesting things that come up from this. So we know, for example, this is one of the basics in exercise science, is that the percentage of maximum that you can sustain during prolonged exercise is a function of the duration. So the longer you go, the less intensity you can sustain. And so the problem is that from minute to minute, your intensity is dropping a little bit if you were just to go out and test like that. And how would the brain know, and how would metabolism know that it must slow you down a little bit every few minutes? And in my view, it doesn't. In my view, that's built in. That is hardwired into all mammalian species that exercise. And what we do when we train is we push it to the limits of our genes. And so those who are the best have the genetic capacity to adapt more and more and more. And that's why that we each reach a limit, a final limit. And even the best athletes obviously also reach that limit. But all I'm saying is that it's not a metabolic limitation. It's something in the control mechanism. So we're trying to bring all of this together in Law of Running. And then more recently, many will know that I had a long debate with Louise Burke, Professor Louise Burke, a colleague. She actually worked with us in Cape Town, and we've rather had divergent opinions since then. And she's on the high carb story, and I'm on the low carb story. And we had a debate in the Medicine, Science and Sports and Exercise, which wasn't entirely satisfactory. And now since our latest publication, which really shows the low carb diet makes no difference, you don't exercise more effectively on a low carb diet, we've now got the evidence. And so the editor of the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, I have to admit, he's a great friend of mine, and he's been pushing the low carb diet for a long time, he says, now we've got a chance to debate the low-carb diet with all this new information. So he's commissioned myself and Louise to have another debate. And I've finished the first article, my statement, and it's much stronger than anything I've ever been able to do. And the beauty is that I can now look at a paper and predict the outcome. If you eat carbohydrates before, during, I can tell the outcome. And what you have to do is you look at the blood glucose response. And if the blood glucose response drops in the control group, then the carbohydrate intervention, whatever it was, will work. And that's because it's the small glucose pool in the liver and the bloodstream that's influencing exercise performance. So you can look at any study. So for example, how do these people who say carbs are so important in the muscles cope with fasting? Because fasting definitely affects your performance. And it does it by making you become more likely to become hypoglycemic because your liver's empty. And so as soon as you start exercising, you're at the limits of your blood glucose levels and so on. So you can't explain that on the muscle glycogen story because fasting has no effect on muscle glycogen. So how does it affect your performance? So when you look at the totality of the evidence, and then this is my final point, I looked at one of Louise's more recent review articles, and she said, here are 6 cases where the low-carb diet impaired performance, every single one of them. The blood glucose dropped during exercise. And that was the reason. So that's the hypoglycemia. So the prediction of the model is exactly what we found. That if you see hypoglycemia, then the carbohydrate's going to work. If you don't see hypoglycemia, carbohydrates aren't going to work.
That's so interesting, Prof. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I've got a question. So does that mean I should eat something before I go and do my exercise?
No, as long as you take something during, you're fine. That's the key. So, but because you have some glucose back in the liver, you've probably got an hour or two before you actually need to take anything. So it covers most forms of exercise. You don't need to bother. It's once you go 3 or 4 or 5 hours that you then need a touch of glucose, not this 120 grams per hour that they're trying to force us. I mean, I read a week ago, 150 grams an hour. I mean, it's ludicrous. And I think Sean Saganowski, who's our great friend on the Nutrition Network and on the Noakes Foundation, he says what's happening is these people are becoming so addicted to carbs. Not only addicted, but their metabolism is addicted to carbs. That as soon as they stop or reduce a little bit, they're in trouble. So they get an inappropriate idea of how important carbohydrates are to them.
Wow. Thank you, Prof. That's so interesting and a relief for me because I don't like eating before I go to the gym, but luckily it's usually just an hour. So we've got a few comments here. Wendy was saying, wonderful to be here and see you both again. Greetings from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. Welcome, Wendy. It's so nice to have you here with us again today. Pinky is saying, thank you so much, Dr. Noakes. You really changed my ultra races with your generous sharing knowledge. I run my ultras completely fasted and I take no carbs since 2018. Never bombed. Interesting.
Now, that Pinky, so you've got a really special liver that can produce lots of glucose, even from fat. You know, the argument always is that you're using protein to make carbohydrate or glucose during exercise. I think it's more than that. I think there are some people who can turn fat into glucose. And the pathways are well described, but they're kind of hidden and difficult to detect. But if you're able to exercise fasted and do ultramarathons, you're producing a lot of glucose in the liver from things other than glucose. So protein is one of them, but I think fat is also, you're converting fat. And you might have pathways that make that more easy. And that's, not everyone can do what you're doing. So many people do need a bit of carbs if they're exercising, particularly after fasting.
That's so interesting. Then I see we've got our first question here. It's from Lucia. Prof. Noakes, I'm curious, in that context, how did you come to the conclusion that 10 grams of carbs suffice to reverse or prevent hypoglycemia?
So Lucia, welcome. Nice to see you again. How did I come to it? You know, by working through for 4 years, I read every single paper there was on carbohydrate ingestion during exercise. And there are a lot of studies suggesting that you don't need much carbohydrate, but they usually came in at about 30 or 40 grams per hour. And then when I realized, I went back to 1994, and John Hawley, when he was in our laboratories, did an absolutely iconic study, and we completely ignored it because it didn't fit what we wanted to. So what we were working on at that time was to work how much glucose could you ingest and the muscles would use. And then eventually, very cleverly, he said, our problem is the blood glucose is too low. Let's get the blood glucose up. So he infused glucose into the bloodstream. And then we found that we got much more glucose oxidation. And the same, when you ingested carbohydrates, you got a higher use of the muscle. Sorry, you got a higher use of the glucose coming from what you've ingested. But what he noticed, when he looked at the data very carefully, ingestion of carbohydrate increased muscle glycogen use. Now you go and read, all of you go and read any textbook that will tell you the reason why carbohydrate ingestion improves performance is because it spares, i.e. reduces muscle glycogen use. But we find there, actually it increased muscle glycogen use. Do you think we made a fuss about it? Of course not, because it didn't fit the model. So we just absolutely ignored it. Anyway, so when I went back and looked at those, and incidentally, we've written this 100-page article on this topic. And when one of the 16 bits of evidence that carbohydrates are not necessary for performance is that there's a small glucose pool, and that's where it works. And that the small glucose pool in the liver and the large glucose pool in the muscle are differentially regulated. And John Hawley's data clearly showed that, as do a lot of other studies from proponents of the carbohydrate diet, just by the way. So what he showed was that when you give glucose, you spare liver glycogen use, but you increase muscle glycogen use. So the two pools must be differentially regulated. And the key is that the insulin spares liver glycogen use and increases liver glucose use. But in the muscle, it inhibits fat oxidation. So the poor muscle has got this high insulin load, and it says, oh my gosh, there's not as much fat circulating, so we have to burn up our glycogen. And we push the boat out, and then when you push the boat out, you can see that that's the very obvious response. So, Lucia, just to answer your question, how did we come to it? Because we realized that they were separately controlled. So before we did that last study, which was published a few weeks ago, I said to Philip Prince, Philip, I want you to take your subjects and put them on the low-carb diet as an experiment before we do the proper studies, and see how much glucose you need to give them to maintain their blood glucose during exercise. And it turned out to be 10 grams an hour. So in that experiment, we could give our athletes 10 grams an hour, and their blood glucose stayed absolutely normal. Whereas when they were fasted and didn't get glucose, their blood glucose levels fell and their performance was impaired, independent of what was happening to muscle glycogen.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Lucia, for that very, very interesting question. Louise is saying, hello, as always, thank you both again for your time and incredible service by sharing this with us. Erica Conradi, I assume this is then not applicable to normal exercising, i.e. not long distance running, etc. Yes,
Erica, absolutely correct, because to deplete your liver of glucose, which is how you induce hypoglycemia, you've got to deplete what's in the liver. And that takes at least 2 to 3 hours of exercise. Even if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. If you're eating a low carbohydrate diet and you're properly adapted, it's probably pretty much the same because you're burning fat instead of glucose in the muscle, so you're sparing a little bit. But it's going to be also about 2 to 3 hours. So going to the gym for an hour is not going to do it.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Erica. Pascal's asking, could you explain, Dr. Noakes, the drop in glucose is so important, even in fat-adapted athletes. Shouldn't we be able to just switch to ketones, or we still need some amount of glucose? Love your work. Greetings from Greece.
Thanks, Pascal, and greetings to you in Greece as well. So, you know, my conversion more recently in the last year or so was when I went back and read Christensen and Hansen's work in 1939. It was published in German, and no one bothered to read it. And I got my German friend to translate it. And then I saw the key was that they took people, they dropped their blood glucose, they gave them glucose, and they could then continue for another hour of exercise. And the key they noticed was that the glucose wasn't being used in the muscles. And that was the key. It was being used to raise the blood glucose concentration. Now, what happened next was that along came the muscle biopsy technique for measuring glycogen. So people said, oh, you see, it's all muscle glycogen. And we forgot the other effect. Sorry, Christensen and Hansen said it's a central brain effect, that the hypoglycemia causes the brain to shut down your exercise capacity. And that fits with our central governor model, because your brain is not stupid. It's not going to push you to the point where it damages itself. And that's the example I gave you earlier. You exercise in the heat, you slow down from the start. You don't wait till you've got heat stroke and then slow down. You slow down long before, because the brain's calculated, okay, if we're going to go at this pace for 2 hours, this is the only pace we can sustain safely. And how does it make those decisions? Well, we don't know, but it's pretty accurate because very few people actually run into trouble. So Christensen and Hansen said it's all a central brain mechanism to protect the body from the brain from hypoglycemia. Then along came the muscle biopsy technique, and my great friend Eddie Coyle did some really good research, but completely misinterpreted it. He just ignored everything that Christensen and Hansen, and he found exactly the same as they found, exactly. But he said, oh, well, we can just ignore that. And how is it working? When you become hypoglycemic, there's not enough blood glucose for the muscles. So when you reverse the hypoglycemia, you give more glucose to the muscles. But he never had any evidence for that. He never tested. We were the first people really to test it here in the last 2 years. So in the 1980s, when he came up with that hypothesis, he didn't test it. And everyone loved it. And because most of the key exercise scientists like Ed Coyle and those guys were being funded by industry, the industry that was promoting carbohydrate consumption during exercise, they, meaning industry, would be much more interested in something that they could sell a lot of. So if they could tell you to eat 120 grams of carbs an hour, that's much more attractive to them than to use only 10 grams an hour. Or even better, if you take 120 grams during exercise and a kilogram of carbohydrates every day before the race for a couple of days. That's what they're looking for. And so that's why that model worked. And I mean, I've just read a paper, another review. It's all muscle glycogen, and you must increase your muscle glycogen content before you exercise. So I would say 99% of the review articles make that statement. And there's very few of us saying the opposite.
Sure. Prof, I have to ask, so what is next? I mean, in terms of your findings and what's you planning to do next with the results?
That's great. Great question. So you know what you have to do? You have to disprove yourself. That's the key. That's the key. And that's why we've been successful. So what will we do? We will immediately test whether if you take more than 10 grams an hour, your performance is better. And that will disprove our claim that you only need 10 grams an hour. And then that will, everything will have to be revised again. But if we come up and we show that we're going to test it against 60 and 90, I think 30, 60, 90 grams an hour. And if we find that there's no difference between 10 and 90, well, then we proved our argument. But if we don't, well, then we have to go and reconsider it again. Exciting. So that's how it works, yeah.
Exciting. And as Noakes Foundation, questioning the science.
Correct.
So coming back to the comment section, I see Andy Taylor saying hi from the UK. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Andy.
Wendy's got a question for you, Prof. At 66, I'm strict carnivore and a master swimmer. 14 swims a week, as well as alternate day home strength training. I love the energy, clear thinking, and wellness that have come with this way of eating. I want to continue to increase my strength and stamina and be optimally lean. Any suggestions? Yes. Can one eat too much fat and store it as body fat, or does excess fat get excreted? And does excess protein get turned to glucose and stored as body fat? And then I see the rest is cut off, Wendy. I can only see until I typically eat a ratio of. So maybe Prof, you can start.
Yeah, so Wendy, that's a great question because it's right at the forefront of the arguments that are currently being discussed by carnivore people. The person who influenced me most of all was Andreas Ehrenfeld. He wrote a lovely book, and in 2010, when I came onto the scene with the low carb, he was probably the leading person on the internet. He had this wonderful website, Diet Doctor. And he visited us in Cape Town, and he was very helpful to me. Then a few years ago, about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, he got involved with Ted Naiman, who is an orthopedic surgeon from the Northwest in America. And he started looking at satiety. And he said that what you really need to eat high satiety foods would have low calories, and the low calories is low fat content. So they have definitely been promoting this idea over the last 2 or 3 years that actually you can eat less fat and more carbohydrate, provided your basis is more than enough protein. And Andreas had just tweeted in the last week or two, and you can follow him. He went on a low satiety, high calorie diet and put on, I think, 5 or 6 kilos very quickly within 2 weeks. And then overnight, he changed to a high satiety, low calorie, i.e. less fat, more carbohydrate, but lots of protein. And he lost the weight in about a week. The 4 kilos disappeared in a week. So he said, well, maybe a lot of it was water. But anyway, that was what he found. So they've also looked at people's weight loss when they follow the high satiety diet. And his data suggests that the higher the diet in satiety, the less calories you take and the more weight you lose. And I'm definitely aware of some people who struggle to lose weight on a high-fat diet. I personally like a high-fat diet because it gives me lots of satiety. And protein, not quite as much. And I think there is a group of people who are incredibly sensitive, and even the little carbohydrate they're getting combined with lots of fat is enough to cause weight gain. You ask, where does the fat come? The fat that you actually store, a lot of it comes from your diet. So that's quite true. So there is a reason for some people to reduce their fat intake, but you must do it by eating high satiety foods, which can have more carbohydrate, but have definitely got more protein. So my answer to you would be to test eating foods that have got more protein in them and perhaps a little bit less fat. And you are allowed to eat a little more carbohydrate as well.
Thank you, Prof. That's so interesting. And I think that stands out for me is how, again, you have to figure out what works for you. Like you said, high fat is not necessarily going to work for everyone. Yeah.
Can I just mention that the great studies in animals is that they eat until they've eaten enough protein. And the evidence for that is really quite dramatic. And then you could say, well, humans are not like these laboratory animals. But there's a lot of evidence that you eat until you've got your protein in, and then you're satiated.
Interesting. So I see Mihail is saying, can you get heart disease for prolonged hypoglycemia due to prolonged fasting?
Michael, no, I don't think so. We think heart disease is linked to excessive high glucose levels and high insulin. So we would think that your body would tell you, in other words, you'd feel so lousy. If you were fasting and you dropped your blood glucose, you'd feel so lousy and be so lethargic and weak that you would increase your carbohydrate intake. I don't see the brain damaging itself by allowing you to get your blood glucose so low. You know, as I've said, in sport, in exercise, it's very clear. Your blood glucose starts falling and very quickly the brain picks it up and your exercise performance goes down long before you reach very low levels. So the brain is intensely monitoring the blood glucose concentration.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. So I see here Themba, he is one of our Eat Better South Africa coaches. He's saying wonderful to be here and hearing such invaluable teaching and the good work you are doing, Prof Noakes.
Thank you, Themba, and thanks to you and as well for the good work that you are doing, and just keep going.
Yes, so Themba will be part of the team that will be implementing the study that we're going to be doing in the noon. I think we posted recently on our social media about it. So if you're interested to learn more about that, we're particularly going to look at metabolic health as well as TB, tuberculosis, and HIV. So we're really excited to see what those results are going to look like. Next, we've got a question from Karen. Karen is our senior researcher with the Noakes Foundation, and she's got a very interesting question for you, Prof. Saying, hi, Prof. One of the biggest criticisms of the carnivore diet is a potential vitamin C deficiency. Have there been any well-controlled studies to show this? Interestingly, there are no blood tests to assess for this deficiency. Is there a reason for this?
That's a great question, Karen, and thanks for posing it. So I'm just going to take a look into history. And if you look at the great walks to the South Pole, the Shackleton was one of the great explorers. And the first time he went south with Scott, he developed severe scurvy due to vitamin C deficiency. And as a consequence, he was sent home by Scott, and he got so angry. He said, I'm going to show Scott that I'm the man, and he isn't. So they began a lifelong argument. So he managed to raise money for the next expedition before Scott could do his next expedition. So Shackleton goes south, having raised just enough money, but not enough money to buy food. So when he arrived in the Antarctic to head off to the South Pole, he realized, my gosh, we haven't got enough food. So what do? They go and shoot the seals and the penguins and so on. And they stock up on that. He gets all the way to 90 miles from the South Pole and back again. No scurvy. So what was he eating? He was eating the carnivore diet, no scurvy. But when he was eating the standard British diet with lots of tin foods, etc., on the previous expedition, he gets scurvy. So I'm not so convinced that the carnivore diet is going to give you scurvy, because in fresh meat, at least, there is enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy. But you're quite right. If you're eating a diet that you're heating the meat all the time, maybe you're not going to get enough vitamin C. So that's one point. And the other point is that a lot of people think that cholesterol, you develop atherosclerosis because cholesterol is trying to fix up the damaged arteries. And that vitamin C is meant to be doing that. But because we don't produce our own vitamin C anymore, humans lost that ability. We perhaps can't fix the arteries with vitamin C, the mechanisms, so we have to use other mechanisms. And the cholesterol mechanism is. So if you are looking for a vitamin C deficiency syndrome, I think coronary atherosclerosis might be it. So yes, I don't know how you would detect it. I personally take about 500 milligrams of vitamin C a day, which is totally safe. And, you know, there are some experiments where people take up to 10 grams intravenously infused in certain conditions and believe that this is helpful. Linus Pauling, of course, promoted the idea that vitamin C could protect or prevent cancer, but he got criticized, but who knows, he might have been onto something. So to answer your question, I don't think anyone's proven that the carnivore diet causes vitamin C deficiency. I've given you an example where clearly it didn't, under the most extreme conditions, but then they were eating fresh meat, fresh seals and fresh penguins. And by the way, the penguin story was that happened because the very first people who overwintered in the Antarctic, all they had was penguins, and they worked out then that you didn't have to get scurvy by eating fresh penguins. So I think that if the meat is not cooked, it probably has enough vitamin C in it. However, I think you raise a very important question, and what you're saying is we can't actually detect vitamin C deficiency. We can only detect it when you get scurvy. So we might all be subclinically vitamin C deficient. So that's a very good question. And well, you're going to have to find a way to detect vitamin C deficiency.
Interesting. So thank you, Carl, for that question. And thank you, Prof, for explaining it so well to us. Jolene, also an Eat Better South Africa coach, saying, favorite people greetings from Johannesburg. And then we've got a question from Andy. What is the biggest impact on an athlete that is insulin resistant but unknown to the athlete? And what would be the symptoms for this athlete?
Well, you're asking me about my career because, I know, fortunately, when I was 28 years old, I was involved in a set of experiments in which we ate high carbohydrate and high fat diets for a period of 3 days. And then we exercised on the treadmill for 2 hours. And then we didn't eat. We fasted for the rest of the day, and we monitored our ketone level. So, and then on one day we didn't do any exercise. So those were the 3 tests. When I ate the high carbohydrate diet, my insulin was six-fold normal. And that was indicating I had severe insulin resistance. This was 28. My BMI was 21. I was obviously the leanest I was at that age. I was running at least 70 miles a week, and I was running regular marathons. Despite that, I had this profound insulin resistance. When I went on the low-carb, high-fat diet, my insulin levels dropped, but they still didn't normalize. They were still 2 to 3 times normal. So even on a low-carb diet, I couldn't reverse the insulin resistance. So I went along until I started putting on weight when I got to about 50, and my running ability dropped. And I think I've showed other symptoms. I would fall asleep in lectures. That's kind of one of the symptoms that you might develop. So I had plenty of symptoms. And then I fortunately converted to the low-carb diet, and they reversed at that time. I'm still profoundly insulin resistant. I can't eat any carbs, anything above 20 grams, and my glucose control gets bad. I have to take metformin. So I think that's a typical story, that you're like me and you think that, I'm running so much. And no question, I used to run 70 to 80 kilometers a week to regulate my weight. Absolutely no question of it. Because I would train hard for the comrades, and then I would finish up by running 160 kilometers a week leading up to the race. And I'd do my thinnest after the race. And a month later, I would have put on 5 to 8 kilograms. And I could never understand this. How could I put on so much weight so quickly? And it was because I was profoundly insulin resistant, and I wasn't being satiated by the diet. So I think that's what we see. I'm just reviewing a paper and showing that it's how marathon running has changed. When I ran marathons, if you didn't run under 3 hours, no one was interested. The race had ended. They'd gone. The people who were timing you had long since gone. So you had to get under 3 hours. So you used to train quite a lot more. Today, the times are getting slower and slower and slower because people are doing less and less running, and it's becoming more a social event. But those days, it was extremely competitive. Why do I make that point? Because I don't think people today, when they run marathons, are really concerned about their time. If they were, they would train more and they'd worry about their weight. So it's more of a social event. And I think, therefore, they're less interested in losing weight by changing their diets. And it's a real concern when you see a lot of people who are clearly insulin resistant being told to eat lots of carbs before exercise and lots of carbs during exercise, but they're actually not really interested in performance anyway. So why don't they just eat a healthy diet, which is not one that's high in carbohydrates?
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Annie, for that question. It's just a good reminder again to understand that just because someone is skinny or lean does not necessarily mean they are healthy.
Exactly right.
Yes, it's so interesting.
And let me just add that in one of our studies, we had 10 athletes, put them on a high-fat or a high-carb diet. 3 of them were frankly pre-diabetic. 3 of them on the high-carb diet, and they had no clue. Yeah. So they were training, but it was the moment they went on the high-fat diet, everything disappeared. You couldn't have thought that they were diabetic. And I think so many athletes are in that position.
Prof, did you realize when you were 28 and you got that high insulin reading, did you realize you were insulin resistant?
So now it turns out that the guy who did the work was Johan Kushner, who became a real expert on diabetes and the role of insulin and glucagon, and wrote some fabulous articles in the Journal of Physiology. But that was in 1981, 1982. And the paper we're talking about was published in 1980. Sorry, so it was 2000 that he began to realize the problem. But honestly, in 1980, no one cared about insulin. Oh, you've got high insulin, of course. You're eating a lot of carbohydrates. You have to clear the system of that.
Okay.
The insulin resistance was just absolutely not understood in those days.
Wow.
And the guy who starts the insulin resistance story is Gerald Raven. And he also actually begins in the 1980s. And his story is really compelling because he's working at Stanford and he's working with the cardiologists are there and they're keeping a beady eye on him. And he starts experiments with low carbohydrate diet. And he shows that your insulin drops, your total cholesterol probably stays the same. HDL cholesterol goes up and triglycerides come down. And he says, gosh, we're reversing the markers of insulin resistance by this low carbohydrate diet. So he does another experiment and he found at a lower carbohydrate intake, it's even better. So what does he do? He stops the research. He stops the research. So you have to ask why, because the next level, he was going to have to put the fat intake above, say, 50%. Yeah. And had he done that, the cardiologist would have said, you're going to kill them, your patients, from hypercholesterolemia, not from diabetes. And he quit. He was on the verge of getting the Nobel Prize. If he'd gone to 25 grams of carbs, or 50 to 25 grams, he would have shown that you can start reversing diabetes. Just while we're on that topic, I got a lovely present yesterday. And it's the Kraft book on testing for diabetes. So Kraft, Joseph Kraft, is one of the great scientists who's under-recognized. Now, the measurement of insulin in the bloodstream was discovered in the 1960s. People knew that there was something in the pancreas that they called insulin, which was necessary to prevent diabetes, but they couldn't measure it in the bloodstream. So from 1920 to 1970, everyone assumed that if you had diabetes, you had a low insulin, and that's why you needed insulin injection. And so that's how people were treated. And Kraft came along, and this was the first time you could actually measure insulin in the bloodstream. And so he told these guys that, hold it, you're measuring glucose, you're doing all those glucose tolerances, why don't you measure insulin? And he did 15,000 tests where he measured insulin. And so he became the world authority on what happens to insulin levels following glucose consumption across the population. And he wrote a book which was largely ignored until recently. A group at Auckland got the data, analyzed it, and Dr. Catherine Kraft published an article, a modern article. And all of a sudden, people began to understand who Kraft was. So anyway, his son asked me to write the foreword to the 3rd edition of his book. And it arrived yesterday with a note from Dr. Kraft, who is still alive. Wow. He must be in his 90s. And it's a great book. So now we're talking about, that was the 1970s. He's the first person to start testing insulin as a marker of insulin resistance. And what he said was that you can have a normal glucose tolerance test and be diabetic, or pre-diabetic, or on the long way to getting diabetes. So he said two things. He said the incidence of diabetes is much higher than we think because we're only measuring the glucose tolerance with a glucose test. And he said, I never saw a patient with coronary artery disease who did not have diabetes. And because they did autopsies, obviously, on some of the patients, whom he knew what their glucose pattern was. And that's an amazing statement because no one has since made it. And I tend to believe that is the case, that it's diabetes that's the main driver of arterial atherosclerosis.
Wow. Thank you, Prof. And thank you for that very interesting question, Andy. So I see Karen here is asking how's law of running going. With Karen, you'll have to rewind the live a bit because Prof gave us the rundown at the beginning of the live and it's going very well.
Yeah, I have to finish by February next year.
Oh,
but in the last 2 months, I've made a huge progress. So it's going very well. Thanks, Karen.
That's amazing. Then Henry is saying, hello, Prof and Jana. And then Karen has another question for you. She's asking, how do you deal with backlash from critics who say you have now changed your mind again and are back on carbs?
Well, I don't think I'm back on carbs. I certainly personally can't go back on carbs because my glucose, which I measure most days, which is unnecessary, but I still do it for a reason that I still don't quite understand. And I know that if I were to eat carbs on the one day, my glucose would be back to the diabetic range the next day. I can look at carbs and they can make my glucose go up. Getting excited. I remember watching a rugby match and when I had a continuous glucose monitoring, my glucose went from 5 to 7.5 within the hour of the rugby match. It was probably Springboks with All Blacks. They just went up like that. And so then I knew that there's not just what you eat, there's emotion involved. So how do you, the backlash? I haven't changed my mind, Karen. I'm still very much on the low carbs, but I know what you're talking about. You're talking about Andreas Eenfeldt. Well, I think that there may be some people who will benefit from eating a little bit of carbs, but actually our focus is on eating more protein. That's the focus. So backlash, well, I think you learn in life that there are people who can change their minds when the data changes and there are others who can't. And I think someone great said, I change my mind when the data changes. What do you do? ? And that's the key. Too many people, their personality is tied up on what they believe. And to change the beliefs is just too difficult because it's sort of like, oh, my character is being attacked to change my mind. I had a lovely tweet the other day. So someone said, why do you always get it wrong? So I said, no, he said, are you always wrong? So I said, yes, often, but at least I'm prepared to admit my error. and that's what makes a difference.
Yeah, I agree, Prof. I see here Wendy just said her ratio, because it's cut off earlier, I'm not sure why. It says the ratio that she typically eats is 70% fat, 30% protein. And then many thanks for your brilliant work and dedication in the nutrition, sports, and wellness field.
Thanks, Wendy.
We've got someone from LinkedIn that says, thank you, Prof Noakes. Greetings from New Jersey. Wish I could watch more, but I have to be for work. Not sure who that is, but remember these lives, they stay on our platform, so you are welcome to come back and rewatch them. You guys saying thank you.
I must just answer, I hope you hear it, but one of my favorite groups of all time was the Four Seasons, also known as the Jersey Boys. When I was going overseas and the Jersey Boys were showing in London, I would go and see it. It was just the most remarkable story of these four guys from New Jersey who formed the Four Seasons group and really exploded onto the musical scene in the 1962, 1963. Lovely story.
Wow. Thanks, Prof. We've got a comment here from Roberto. We hope Philippines will also change our nutrition guidelines, copied from standard American diet. And then, interesting comment, hope there will be research on carnivore, low-carb, and vegan, with prisoners for 5 years with results every 3 months.
Yes. I'm not sure, Roberto, if you're telling me that research is ongoing. What I do know is that if you put prisoners on a high-fat, low-carb diet, there's much less violence in the jail. That's the evidence that we have. Oh.
And then Louise is saying she already started with the carnivore training from the Nutrition Network, and she is loving the content. Our next question, Prof, is from Roselle. Hello, Prof Noakes. Is there a test to measure insulin resistance?
Yeah, Roselle, there are many, and I think that it begins with your fasting insulin, and you need your fasting insulin to be as low as possible. Now, if you read the medical textbook, the fasting insulin value considered to be normal is between, say, 10 and 20. That's already pre-diabetic. You need to get it down below 5. We found in the laboratory that if you test athletes where you've made the insulin low, if you're below 6, they will burn an enormous amount of fat during exercise, and they will just continue burning fat. If you start at above 6, they burn less fat. So there's something in the body that once your value goes below 6, your metabolism is totally different. And so we think your metabolism is correct once your blood insulin level drops below 6 units. So that's the best test. And then the other ones will be all the tests for diabetes. Glucose, fasting glucose is elevated above 6.5, but that's already way diabetic. The other one is the glycated hemoglobin, HbA1c. And if your value is above 5.5, you're on the road to diabetes. Your doctor will look, oh, 5.5, fantastic, that's great. But if you're eating a high-carb diet and your value is 5.6, you're 10 years away from it being 6, and you're 15 years away from it being 6.5. That is the inevitable outcome. So you might as well cut the carbs now when your value's gone above 5.5, 5.6.
Thank you, Prof, for that, and thank you for that interesting question. I see Karen was just saying she was referring to the study and the 10 grams of carbs in the exercise. And then I see Neil is asking if you can post his questions here. Yes, please, Neil, you're welcome to post your questions for Prof here in the comment section, and we will get to it. I see we've got about, almost 10 minutes left of the live, and we've got a few questions, Prof, that came in prior to this session, and also some questions that stood over from previous live. So I think we're going to look at them. So the first question I have here is from Frederik. Hello, I have a question for Dr. Noakes. The Q&A on the 27th, and it's about high cholesterol in the context of eating a very low-carb, whole foods, animal-based diet. I have been keto for the past 12 years, and I recently had a blood test that showed I have total cholesterol above 600. My doctor freaks out and wants to put me on statins. I'm a 44-year-old lifetime athlete, endurance and strength. I have a body fat percentage of around 10% and healthy apart from some work-related stress that I try to address. Do I need to worry? If so, what can I do to better my numbers?
Yeah, you got what's called the lean body mass hyperresponder. And what's happening in your case is your cholesterol metabolism is totally different to the people who are eating a high-carb diet. It's absolutely, completely different. So we can't say, oh, because if you're eating the traditional American diet and you have a cholesterol, as you said, of 600, we can't say that the same will apply if you're eating a carnivore diet and you've got a cholesterol of 600. The metabolism is utterly, totally, completely different. And there is currently a study ongoing. It's gone over 5 years so far, but it will continue, in which they looked at the coronary artery plaque load, how much narrowing and damage there is in the coronary arteries, in people with your condition versus normal healthy people who have normal cholesterol. And there was no difference in the amount of damage that had happened to the coronary arteries. My advice for you would be to have a coronary artery calcium score done. That is the best predictor of anything. It outmatches anything. You have your coronary artery calcium score, which is a non-invasive test. They inject a dye into your bloodstream, and then they take a picture of your heart as the dye passes through. There's no operations. There's no opening your chest or anything. There's no coronary angiography required. It's a non-invasive test. And incidentally, the score that you're going to get was developed by the guy who wrote the South Beach Diet book. He's a doctor, obviously in South Florida. He wrote the book, made a fortune, but at the same time worked on this calcium, coronary artery calcium score. And the score you're given is his numbers, and his name applies to it. And he's got an odd name, which I just can't quite remember at the moment. It begins with an A. But anyway, it's his test, and subsequently it's shown that that's the best predictor of your outcome. And if you have a cholesterol of 600 and a coronary artery calcium score of 0, you are good to go for many, many years yet. And it's very improbable that you will ever develop coronary artery disease. Okay, that's the one story. Let's say you came back with a score of 400 or 800, which means you're at increased risk. Okay, but it's still not certain that it's the cholesterol that's doing it. There's something else, in my opinion. There's the diabetes, which you probably don't have, and there's clotting problems. And the great tragedy in modern medicine, there are many tragedies, but the one is that because you were told that it's cholesterol, you were told that a statin will reverse it, and the statin is nothing. And so what the National Institute of Health for the last 30 years has not studied one other intervention to slow the rate of coronary artery disease. Not one study have they funded. Because why should we bother? We've got the solution, which is a statin. But statins make zero difference. If you have a CAC score of 400 to 800, you can take all the statins in your life, it's not going to make any difference. So if you, let's worry about that later, that if you were to find that you did have a high CAC score, it puts you at increased risk, but then you've got to look at all the clotting mechanisms, because that's what will be the cause. And we don't know enough about that. But I would certainly go on anti-clotting medication, and I'd investigate inflammation. But you shouldn't have much inflammation because you're lean. And that's the other key, that most of the inflammation that we have in the human body is from fat cells that are too full. So particularly in the gut, in the intestine, not in the abdomen. When those fat cells become too big, they start producing the inflammation. Yeah.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you for that question. Something you mentioned now made me think of one of the other questions we got, and then Neil, we will get to your question. If I can just find it, was about lipedema.
Lipedema,
yes.
Yeah, lipedema.
Yes, so someone asked, Prof, I follow a low-carb, mostly carnivore lifestyle, which helps me maintain symptoms of lipedema, but I've always wondered what is actually the cause of lipedema, and do you think it's something that can be improved or even cured through a low-carb or carnivore diet?
Yeah, I think it can be cured. I mean, I've seen pictures. So what happens in some people is that they store fat in the legs particularly, and the buttocks, and that prevents diabetes. That's one of the keys. So one of the reasons why I got diabetes, I can't store fat in my muscles or my buttock. Those cells just won't prepare. They'd rather have the fat stored in the abdomen. And that's where the problem is. So many people carry a lot of weight in their legs and their buttocks, but are at no risk of diabetes because those cells are quite happy to store the fat. And then if you store a lot of it, obviously some people get worried about it and what should they do? I have seen evidence that if you go on a strict carnivore diet and you get your insulin down as low as possible, but you've got to eat 0 carbs, essentially, because your cells are so sensitive to insulin. And that's what you find in anyone who's lost weight on this diet. The first fat you lose is around your face here, and the last fat is around your tummy. That is because, and the difference is that the cells up here are not very sensitive to insulin. You've got to have a lot of insulin circulating to put on weight here. But around your abdomen, around your waist particularly, those cells are so sensitive to insulin that just a drop of insulin, they will store fat. And I think that's what happens, that some people are intensely sensitive. They've got fat cells that are intensely sensitive to insulin. And you've just got to keep the insulin as low as possible by cutting the carbs. And the problem is fat, protein, and insulin. Protein also causes quite a lot of insulin secretion. So this is an area that hasn't really been resolved in my mind. enough that you can still secrete insulin when you're eating protein.
Thanks, Prof. That's very interesting. And thanks, Jess, for that question. I see Neil posted a question here for us. Hello, I'm writing from Hong Kong. My 8-year-old daughter is playing tennis at a good level and takes it very seriously. I'm trying to limit her carbohydrate intake as much as possible, but it is challenging in the expat community where cookies and other carb-heavy treats are common. In your opinion, what's a reasonable daily carb limit for kids her age? My goal is to keep it close to 0, but I'd like some guidance on what's practical, healthy, and good for sports like tennis. And then he says, I do accept that this is not medical advice.
Thanks, Neil. So I won't expect a lawyer's letter coming next week. So, Neil, the answer is your daughter will do extremely well on a 0 carbohydrate diet. The problem is that she will be slightly less carb addicted than the average child, because I suspect she was not exposed to all the sugar and carbohydrates from pregnancy. It starts in pregnancy. So if the mother has a high carbohydrate diet, she's already addicting the child to high carbohydrate diet. And so the prevention of carb addiction starts in the womb with the mother not eating carbohydrates. So the big problem is not so much the carbs, it's just the whole sugar addiction issue. And it's impossible for young girls to grow up not having much carbohydrate. So you just have to convince her that she doesn't want to get sugar addicted, and that the more protein and fat she eats, the healthier she will be. She will be stronger and she will be taller. If you want to be tall, you must eat animal protein. And all the sugar in the world will just make you shorter. So that's what you need to tell her. And she wants to be tall to be a good tennis player. So that's the way I would sell it to her. And somehow you've got to get rid of the sugar addiction. That's absolutely the key. Everyone I speak to, when the first thing they said, Dr. Noakes, I want to adopt your diet, I said, okay, are you prepared to give up sugar? Because that's the key, and to stop eating ultra-processed foods. So you need to cook for her and prepare foods from prepare the food as real food, and not use any processed food, or essentially no processed food.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Neil, for that question. I think, Prof, we've got chance for one more. Shall we squeeze in one more question? Yes, okay. There's an interesting question from Anel, and she's saying, good day. After years of knowing about banting, I've thought to really investigate what it's all about. My husband and I are both very active, and our latest adventure is to attempt to do the Drakensberg. 210 kilometers, 3,000 elevation per day in sub 75 hours. Wow.
Great, well done.
Nutrition is therefore key. With our last training weekend in the Berg, I realized how quickly I ran out of fuel and almost constantly needed to take in food like bars, etc., just to feel I can continue. My husband had, high cholesterol and is taking meds for that, and we basically had him, as per traditional dietitian advice, on a low-fat diet. His cholesterol lowered, and we redid the test last year, and the value was total cholesterol of 4.9, triglycerides, was 1.1, HDL 1.4, LDL 3.2, and non-HDL 3.5. He is, however, always hungry. So here's my question.
But it's interesting, he's not fat. Am I gathering that?
Yeah. Taking his cholesterol into consideration, should we just abruptly change to a high-fat, low-carb diet, or should he continue on his meds? I assume my next question is answered somewhere in one of Tim's books or videos, but I couldn't find the answer right away. How do we fuel during an event, whether a marathon or a hike, and then the DGT, that's the hike they're going to do. And we are both a very comfortable weight with very little fat. Although he has a little bit of belly fat, which has reduced on the low fat, high carb, also eating lean protein diet. Thank you for taking the time to answer the questions. I have a lot to learn and feel quite unsure, although excited about the change.
That's fabulous, because your husband is metabolically in good shape, even though he's eating the less ideal diet. So he's one of these guys who can get away with eating more carbs and less fat and not become fat and not become metabolically compromised. So whereas we're normally talking to people who are profoundly insulin resistant and who absolutely need to cut carbs, your husband doesn't need to cut carbs to the same extent. He can get away with almost any carbohydrate intake that he likes. And how do I know that? Because his triglycerides are low and his HDL is high, and the ratio is good. It could be better. He could get the triglycerides down, way down to 0.5 if he wanted to, but that would mean he has to go eat a lot more fat and less carbohydrate. Okay, so the first thing you need to learn is you should never measure your blood cholesterol concentration, okay? So, because the whole idea that saturated fat causes high cholesterol, causes arterial disease, has been disproven so many times. And I went to court on that, and I wrote the book, The Real Food on Trial, in which I discuss all the evidence that they got it wrong. And the one study, the most famous study, they paid $700 million. $700 million. It's the best test of the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet on health in women. And all it showed was that if you started this trial, which was a 13-year trial, and you already had established heart disease, this diet increased your probability of more problems by 67%. And they ignored it, and they tried to write it out of history. And I discovered it and managed to write an article about it. So that's the test. And all the other evidence is exactly the same. You don't prevent heart disease by lowering cholesterol. There's just no evidence for it. You prevent heart disease by avoiding diabetes. And as I mentioned, what Dr. Kraft said, that if you have arterial disease, you have diabetes. Now, I don't believe your husband has diabetes. I'm sure some of those values would be more abnormal. But what he needs to do is measure his fasting insulin, his fasting glucose, and his HbA1c, glycated hemoglobin. And if those values are all in range, then it's, as I said, metabolically, he's remarkably healthy, even though his diet could be better, much better. If he goes on a high-fat diet, which will be metabolically the best diet for him, his cholesterol may well go through the roof. And it could hit 20. It could hit 10, it could hit 20. And then he's going to go to the doctor, and the doctor's going to say a few things to him and to me for giving that advice. So that's the problem. So my solution is, if he has no diabetes and he's clearly metabolically fine, don't change anything. Just keep monitoring it every year and see what happens. Aha! But now he wants to do the walk across the Drakensberg. Now, there's no question. There's one diet for that, and that's the high-fat diet, the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet. So, but he needs to do it for about 4 weeks. So one solution might be to follow a high-fat, low-carb diet for 4 weeks, to do the walk and then go back to the diet that he's comfortable with and which the doctor is comfortable with. But definitely, the problem is if you try to walk the Drakensberg on carbs, you've got to carry a whole lot of carbs with you. Whereas the best analogy I can give to you is if you're watching these trucks come past and you'll see there comes a lorry with plenty of petrol, this massive fuel thing full of petrol, but it's a diesel-driven car, and it stops. So it stops because it's got no diesel, but on its back, it's got all this petrol. And that's what the problem for humans is. Humans have got so much petrol in the form of fat, but they try to run on the carbohydrates. And then when they run out of the carbohydrate, they've still got this massive petrol source, but they can't use it. When I'm putting you on a high-fat diet, I'm accessing that fat fuel. And then you don't have to eat all the carbs that you are trying. So your case is the same. I don't know what your metabolic profile is like. It probably is also excellent, in which case the same applies. You again, I would advise to eat a high-fat diet for 4 weeks. Do the walk, and in the walk, you only eat protein and fat. And 10 grams of carbs per hour maximum. And you'll find that your appetite is much more satiated. You don't have to stop every 5 minutes to eat carbs, and you'll go the whole way. I was reading what did the Tour de France cyclists eat in 1900 when they couldn't get hold of food. The one guy packed 8 lamb chops in his backpack. He would take 1 chop an hour. Okay, so that's the one story. But I'm also reading one of the great heroes of South African distance running, a guy called Arthur Newton, who really developed ultramarathon running. He would run up to, believe this or not, 200 miles a week. And this is in 1924. 1924, he was running up to 250 miles a week. Fantastic story. He went and obliterated all the world records for ultramarathon races. And I'm reading this morning about his sets the world record for the 100 miler. Guess what he ate? He ate eggs and bacon for breakfast, and that was it. That was what he needed. And then Jackie Meckler and Wally Hayward were the next 2 great comrades runners. They also both won the race 5 times, as Newton had. And they went to Britain in 1954, 53 or 54, I can't remember, I think it was 53, to tackle all his records on the road that he'd set the records on. And when Wally Hayward wrote to Arthur Newton, he said, the one thing we have to have is meat. That's what we're going to live on while we're with you. And of course, Newton realized that because he was eating that way. So that's what these guys who set these world records, which were unmatched at the time, they were a level higher than anyone else. And they were eating the high protein carnivore type diet, and that was standard. And then, unfortunately, along came the US dietary guidelines, and all of a sudden we had to eat carbs instead.
Wow, that is so interesting, Prof. And thank you so much, Anel, for asking that question. I really love listening to your answer. I always feel a little bit inspired. I would love to do a hike like that. I just need to practice a little bit. So yeah, thank you, everyone. We have come to the end of our live today. I see here just 2 last comments. Activate mission to the same timeline. That is the profile there, saying just want to thank Prof Tim Noakes for the knowledge. And then Erica is saying, thank you, Prof Noakes and Jana. This was absolutely illuminating. Love that word. Thank you, Erica, and thank you everyone else that joined us today. It was lovely. We had so many interesting questions. I think we managed to get to all of the questions that were on the live. However, there are still a few questions that I've got from previous lives and from emails that were sent, but don't worry, we keep them, and next time we will hopefully be able to get to all of them. Just a reminder again about the Nutrition Network's Carnivore training that launched yesterday, and also to keep an eye out for the whole body health program that starts early April. I hope everyone will have a lovely day wherever you are in the world, so a lovely morning, a lovely afternoon, or a lovely evening, wherever you might find yourself. And we are looking forward to see you next time. Prof, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming here and giving us your time and answering all these questions. It's really interesting. I always learn something new. Have a lovely day further, everyone.
Thanks, Jana. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.